Absolutely.
Oh.
Very lucky.
Yes. So I'm going to start, if that's okay with everyone. Are we all ready? Yes? Okay. So thank you so much to all of you that are connected with us this evening. Thank you so much for being here and welcome to this event on COVID-19 and its impact on persons deprived of liberty. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Rosa Saluri and I'm Associate Dean for International and Comparative Legal Studies at GW Law School, and I am thrilled and honored to have the panel of speakers that we have today. We have probably some of the leading global figures on human rights that have dedicated time to us this evening. So I want to thank all of our speakers for being here today, and I'm actually going to introduce them in alphabetical order by last name. I'm going to start with James Cavallaro, who's actually the Executive Director of the University Network for Human Rights, but he's also a former president, a former commissioner, and former rapporteur on persons deprived of liberty of the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. And he has also been a professor for Harvard University and Stanford University Law School. And he has a very distinguished career when it comes to persons deprived of liberty and other human rights issues in general as well. We also have here today Sofia Galban, who's actually a senior attorney at the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. And Sofia also has a very interesting and very rich career working with persons deprived of liberty, but also persons with disabilities as well. It's really wonderful to have her with us today. We also have with us Professor Juan Mendez. And Professor Juan Mendez, there's so much to say about Professor Juan Mendez. I mean, he's currently a professor of human rights at American University Law School. He's also a former United Nations rapporteur on torture and special advisor on the prevention of genocide, among many international positions he has held. And he's also a former president and commissioner of the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. And he's kind of the professor of all of us today. He really is a leading global figure on human rights issues, and it's quite an honor and a privilege to have him in this space today. And lastly, but definitely not least, we have Eric Rosendahl with us today. He's not only the executive director, but also the founder of Disability Rights International, who really works on a daily basis to ensure the full participation in society and the full protection of human rights of persons with disabilities. This is an incredible organization. I feel very privileged that I was able to see the work of DRI very, very closely when I was at the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, and it's an organization that gives so much visibility to the situations and the challenges of persons with disabilities. Is really an amazing thing that he has done in his career, and he has, of course, held many other positions as well. And thank you so much, Eric, for being with us here today. I also want to thank our co-sponsors of this event. We actually have co-sponsors the American Society of International Law, also the Washington Foreign Law Society, and also our International Law Student Society at GW Law School. And I wanted to share with all of you just some brief thoughts before I actually ask a number of questions to our panelists today. I want to start by highlighting the gravity and the magnitude of COVID-19 and how it has really changed the way we all live. We were just discussing this before this panel, how basically we live now in a completely virtual world, and we have all these governments that have been adopting a range of measures to prevent the spread of COVID-19, including the ordering of closing of businesses, of schools, social distancing measures. We have also seen the closing of borders and many other measures that we're still seeing on a daily basis. And in the analysis related to COVID-19 and human rights issues, it has emerged and it has been revealed how difficult and complex is the situation of persons deprived of liberty. And they have really been identified as a group by a number of international organizations and bodies as a group at particular risk of not only the spread of COVID-19, but death of COVID-19 and also increased human rights violations. When we talk about persons deprived of liberty, we are talking not only about persons in prisons, we're also talking about persons in psychiatric institutions. We're also talking about persons in immigration centers and other forms of state custody. And there are a number of structural and systemic situations that render persons deprived of liberty more at risk, to COVID-19 in many ways. We're talking about high concentration of persons in confined spaces and overcrowding. We have challenges in implementing many physical distancing measures. We have limited access to good hygiene conditions and healthcare. And we also have forms of violence and discrimination that are already occurring in these forms of state custody that are worsened by COVID-19. A lot of what our panelists are going to be discussing today are the different kinds of human rights that are involved, in when you analyze from a human rights lens the situation of persons deprived of liberty. And there are many. We're talking about the human rights to life, to personal integrity, to dignity, the right to health, the right to food security, the rights to non-discrimination and violence, the right to be free from torture and access to judicial protection and guarantees, among others. But I think one important message to start with is that many of these problems were already there, and COVID-19 in many ways is really worsening systemic and structural situations that we already had, affecting and imposing important barriers in the fulfillment, respect, and guarantee of the rights of persons deprived of liberty. Before I actually start with the questions, I want to ask all of you to please keep your microphones off during the event so that we can preserve the bandwidth. We will have an opportunity to ask questions, and please, if you have questions, feel free to write them in the chat function, because we will have an opportunity to ask questions to the panelists. And again, thank you so much for being here with us this evening. So I want to start with one question to Jim, if that's okay with Jim. I wanted to ask you to please start discussing the main challenges and prospects faced by persons deprived of liberty in the present. How have these existing problems been impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic, and what are the challenges and possibilities moving forward?
So, thank you. It's really a privilege to be here, particularly on this panel with our mentor Juan and other colleagues with whom I've had the privilege to work through the Inter-American system and outside the Inter-American system. So it's hard to give a succinct answer, but I will try and do this by category. Throughout the Americas, particularly in Latin America, the main challenges facing people deprived of liberty before COVID involve significant overcrowding, unhealthy living conditions, physical violence, extortion, corruption, other forms of abuse, prisoner-on-prisoner violence, although much guard-on-prisoner violence, lack of adequate medical care, lack of legal access, etc. So that basically the term often used in Spanish is deposito, the idea of detention centers, rather than fulfilling the purported objective of rehabilitation as being places, deposits, as it were, where those that society wishes to take out from its view and relegate to invisibility are sent with virtually no oversight or very little oversight, which allows for all sorts, as you can imagine, of corruption, vice, and abuse. That's the default setting, and again, in exceptionally overcrowded and unhealthy living environments, suffocating in some places in Latin America, suffocating just in terms of the numbers of people in a physical space with the constant contact that promotes illness without a pandemic like COVID. In the US and Canada, the situations are different. The overcrowding is less severe, but there are high degrees of brutality, insufficient oversight, and the idea of deposit or deposito as a place to hold outcasts is a fair description of what's happening. Eric and others can talk about the specificities of people who have mental health challenges and the way they face particular abuses, often within ordinary detention centers, unfortunately. And then one can talk about how youth who should be separated or not separated, how women face particular abuses in detention centers, often in situations where they are not protected from either male prisoners or male supervisors. So basically, disaster is the default setting before COVID. And then, as I think we've seen in general with COVID, and as you said, Rosa, COVID has really served to shine a light on the inequalities, on the hierarchies, on the injustices in our societies in general. And it sort of has been an opportunistic infection socially, not medically, I'm speaking socially, in that it has attacked the most vulnerable populations across the board. And because people deprived of liberty are in a situation of extreme vulnerability, it's hit them much worse. Contagious diseases, to give one example, in Peru, which is a case that I'm looking at and in contact with folks working on Peru, just dreadful numbers of illnesses. In one testing, which they did in May, over 40% of those tested positive. So they really are closed centers that are the worst, have the worst possible environments to prevent the spread of the disease, and therefore there's been high levels of contagion, high levels of illness, high levels of death, both for those incarcerated and also for prison guards. So that's sort of the basics, and others can certainly complete the picture, but I think the picture is bleak from all of the data and information that I've seen.
Thank you, Jim. And I wanted to connect with Eric now because you mentioned the situation of persons with disabilities, right, which have their actual specificities when it comes to the impact of COVID-19 as well. And one thing that I wanted to ask you, Eric, is if you could discuss the effects of COVID-19 on persons with disabilities, and in particularly persons that are in psychiatric institutions and under state custody. And also if you could talk a little bit about the international law standards that are applicable to their situation.
Well, thank you very much. You know, what Jim described in terms of people in detention generally, and summed it up as bleak, certainly applies to people with disabilities in detention. You know, from kids in orphanages to adults in psychiatric hospitals to social care homes, and frankly, nursing homes that we hear a lot about actually are mostly people with disabilities. But there is one fundamental way in which this population is different from the other groups in detention that we're talking about. And that is, these people should never have been in detention anyway. That before the pandemic, there was a fundamental problem that existed in any country of the world, but particularly in the Americas, where outdated psychiatric systems, outdated social service systems, outdated orphanage systems dumped people with disabilities in places in theory for their own benefit, for their rehabilitation or treatment, when both from a scientific point of view, we know people are not, they don't recover from being institutionalized and segregated from society. Institutions make them worse. The last place you want to treat a person for mental illness is locked up in an institution. The trauma of institutionalization was dangerous before COVID-19. And so what we had was a system, and the system is vast. We're not talking about small numbers. Globally, there are 10 million children in congregate care, and no one has begun to even look at how many adults, how many elders. So we're talking 20, 30, 40 million people, maybe 50 million people around the world with disabilities who are segregated from society in detention, and they shouldn't have been there. So they are the ones who are cut off, and we read about nursing homes as being ground zero for where the deaths take place. Well, what we don't read about, because no one is looking at them, is that all of these places of detention are also ground zero for large numbers of deaths. It's not just elders. Statistically, people with disabilities have health conditions that are associated with it. And so the studies that have shown that people with disabilities have a 5 times greater rate of getting the infection and a 2 times greater rate of dying once they have the detention anyway. So combined, number one, vast numbers of people locked up and segregated who shouldn't have been there. Then because of their disability, they're particularly exposed, and we have a disaster of enormous proportions. I have spent 25 years of my career warning against the institutionalization of people with disabilities, saying we have to end it. I did not want to be so right as to say these places are dangerous. But right now, it's like a house on fire, and we have to get people out, and we have to do it under the worst circumstances. We have to do it now before large numbers of deaths take place, and they are happening. Legally speaking, the legal basis for this exists. The UN Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities brought a completely new paradigm to this law. It's not about standards of detention, having a hearing, having a lawyer. Are you dangerous to yourselves or others? The UN Convention says all people with disabilities have a right to be part of society. And so we have to transform the way people look at it, not just better institutions. We need to get them out. And under COVID-19, we got to pull them out before the house burns down.
Thank you, Eric. And so, Sophia, I wanted to connect what Eric said with you because the Inter-American Commission, where you used to work, has been very active. You know, they have really been issuing resolutions and many statements related to COVID-19. And they have identified a number of groups, you know, that are at particular risk. I mean, one of them is persons deprived of liberty. If you could share with us a little bit about what they have said, recommendation statements, and what they think are the priority issues at the moment.
Sure. First of all, I would like to thank you, Rosa, for inviting me to this event to speak about a very, very important topic that unfortunately is not really visible. So I feel very honored and privileged to share this space with these fantastic speakers whose work and commitment I admire greatly. So thank you so much, Rosa. And talking a little bit about the statements and recommendations of the Inter-American system, I would like to highlight that also the Inter-American Court has issued a very important statement. It is called Human Rights Pandemic. It was published in April of this year. And the court recognizes that the situation faced by persons deprived of liberty is of a great concern. And in this regard, the court establishes two types of recommendations. The first one to reduce overcrowding, and the second one is to apply alternatives to confinement. The Commission has done or is still giving a lot of attention to these issues because I consider that the situation that these persons are facing is extremely serious. And the Commission has issued a very important resolution. It's the 1/2020, Pandemic and Human Rights in the Americas, and also has published many press releases that contain very important recommendations and has requests from states a lot of information under the confidential mechanism. So the Commission is paying a lot of attention to these issues. And I think that I can talk about the work on the Commission in two specific aspects. The first one is the assessment that the Commission is doing regarding the facts, I mean the situation they're facing in the light of condition of detentions. And basically the Commission is saying that it's impossible to really guarantee life and personal integrity considering the overcrowding that prevails in the jails in the region. And secondly, the Commission has established different recommendations. And before talking a little bit about the most important recommendations, I would like to share with you, if it's possible, very few images of how the overcrowding looks like. Because particularly when we talk about this topic, like overcrowding is a word that is always there. But people may not have had the opportunity to go to prisons and to really see how overcrowding looks and how that really affects the enjoyment of rights of persons deprived of liberty. So I have here some pictures that we have taken within the work of the Commission in the field that I think that is very valuable to show. So I am going to do it right now. tell me if you can see the, you can see it. Here we are in a jail in Costa Rica, San Sebastian, and actually James Cavallaro is there. The capacity of the prison was 88 persons at that time, and when we visited, that was February of 2016, was 271 persons. And you can see how people are living inside that cells. Here we have a women's prison in Guatemala. We visited this prison in July of 2017, and I remember when I was in that place, I thought that maybe they were having a party or something like that, you know, because there are so many people out there. But no, it's just how they were living, considering that the capacity at that time was 250 persons, and by the dates of the visit, we were talking about more than 1,000 people living in that space. And how this prison looks inside is like that. You can see that there are very, very tiny bulk beds, and in that little space, 6 women were sleeping. Basically, there was the head to feet, so they can really fit in that tiny space. And here we are we were in a police detention center in Buenos Aires, and we were in a comisaria, how it is called there, and there were 2 cells for 6 people. And see how many we found. 14 people living in a space of 6. And here we can see as well James Cavallaro in this visit of November of 2016. And when we listen that the states are taking steps to reduce overcrowding, we can find what is going on in Brazil, for instance. If you can notice, you know, at the top of the bunk bed, there are like additional beds. And this is how sometimes states are doing, you know, to really like reduce overcrowding, where it's evident and a measure that is not effective. So I just wanted to share how overcrowding really looks like. And to be very, very brief, because I think that I'm taking a lot of time already, I would like to highlight that the Commission has issued 6 very important recommendations on the issues. The first one, and it's like evident, is reduce overcrowding in prisons. And how we do that? Well, we have to reassess cases specifically on pretrial detention to be able to apply alternative measures of confinement. And the second recommendation is prioritizing people who are in greater risk of COVID contagion, like older persons, like persons with chronic or autoimmune diseases, but also pregnant women. In this recommendation, it's also very important to highlight that the Commission has given like more strict requirements in case of older persons who have been convicted of serious human rights violations or crimes against humanity, because as you know, in the region, we have very specific situation regarding the dictatorship, for instance, in Argentina or in Guatemala. So there are additional requirements like taking into consideration before the states apply these measures, the legal interest at stake, seriousness of the facts, but also the responsibility of the state to punish these kind of violations. The third one, the third recommendation is basically focused on detention conditions, what the states can do to really stop the spreading of the virus, which I honestly think that it's really impossible considering like overcrowding prisons. The fourth one is to adopt urgent measures to guarantee that mechanisms to prevent and combat torture can visit facilities, because there has been a lot of restrictions that basically these kind of mechanisms cannot enter and document the human rights violations that are taking place right now, specifically in all the isolation measures that are being taken, you know, to avoid the spread of the virus. The fifth one is to guarantee the exterior contact with families. And the sixth one is establish like protocols to ensure like the order within the prisons, and this is because in these last or previous months there has been an increase in the violence in the prisons for all this panic and all the situation that the lack of health is causing between the inmates.
Thank you, Sophia, and particularly for the images. I mean, there's nothing like images, you know, when it comes to human rights issues. And both you and I, we have been very privileged to be able to go and see a lot of places, and they will never stop moving us in terms of the gravity of what's happening, right? So, Professor Mendez, I want to turn to you. And you have been president of the Inter-American Commission, and you have also been United Nations Rapporteur on Torture, right? So you can connect very well those Inter-American standards with also those universal human rights standards. How do you see all the issues that have been presented that persons deprived of liberty are facing, and how do you see them connected to the problem of torture? And how do you see the intervention of international law here and international bodies?
Well, thanks, Rosa. And first, let me thank you for the privilege of participating in this webinar with you and with these very distinguished fellow panelists. It's great also to see the many friends that one makes along the years of work in human rights. I actually, yes, I have continued to visit prisons after I left the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, particularly as a special rapporteur. And I've tried in the last 6 months to follow the problem of the problems that have been identified, but as affected by COVID-19. And I'd like to say that my first reaction was that maybe now we were going to have a serious discussion about the abuse of preventive detention. Unfortunately, I've been disappointed. We have yet to have a serious discussion of the abuse of preventive detention, but the overcrowding in Latin American jails or prisons, but also everywhere in the world or many places in the world, has a lot to do with criminal policies about criminal justice and when it's advisable and necessary to have somebody who has not been convicted of any crime spend time in prison waiting for a trial. In Latin America particularly, our states abuse the use of preventive detention, among other things because there's a lot of pressure from public opinion, many times misguided by sensationalist media. And that has been seen again during the COVID-19 pandemic, because at first some courts, to their credit, took some very timid but important decisions about ordering or relaying to the lower courts the instructions to look seriously at releasing some of the overcrowding by releasing people who did not need to be in prison, or who had spent a long part of their sentence already, etc. Unfortunately, that didn't go very far, because immediately the concern with citizen insecurity and crime reverted many of those decisions. But we also, with alarm, we noticed some of the immediate decisions that were taken by prison authorities throughout the region, and including in the United States, I should say, is first to announce releases that then never really materialize, or many of them don't materialize. And that has been, according to the Marshall Project here in the United States, that follows these things very closely, has been a problem with the United States, where Attorney General Barr announced that he had ordered the release of something like 5,000 federal prisoners, and but then the decisions were made case by case and on the spot, and state and federal court by federal court, and the numbers really were not that high. But in addition to that, the first thing that prisons did was to isolate people and to isolate them in solitary confinement, which, like Eric has said, affects the mental health of anybody, but particularly those who are already struck with disabilities, psychosocial disabilities, who, by the way, are the majority of people who go to solitary confinement in prisons everywhere in the world. There are people that prisons cannot control because they have psychosocial disabilities, and solitary confinement only makes them worse. And then the other measure that was taken was to cut off family visits. And you would think, well, that's reasonable. They would, it's in order to prevent the spread. But if you don't have any alternative to that, like, for example, creating the conditions that you can use either Zoom or some other form of communication, cellular phones, etc., this creates a lot of anxiety in prisoners and in their families. And in addition, that also creates, exacerbates some of the overcrowding problems, because especially in Latin America, it is a family visit that inmates depend on for cleaning materials like soap and water, alcohol, etc. Sanitary alcohol, I mean. And those are not and were not, even during the pandemic, provided, at least initially, by the prison authorities. But I think the main problem that we have in Latin America is the lack of transparency. Oh, another measure that was taken was to cut off any possibility of access by national preventive mechanisms or other institutions of control. And it's true also that you have to have protocols to conduct those kinds of, regular visits during a pandemic, but there weren't any protocols. And so for months we have had situations in which the control mechanisms have been unable to know what's going on inside prisons. And this brings me to my point about the lack of transparency. We just don't know how conditions are in many Latin American countries. We know that some courts have ordered releases. We know that some releases have happened. We also know that there's been a backlash in public opinion about them. But I think the situation has to be a lot worse than what we've been discussing. Just to mention the United States, I just checked today the webpage of the Marshall Project. And in the United States alone, there have been 143,243 cases of COVID-19, and about 117 of them have recovered, which leaves about 26,000 people in custody who are sick with COVID-19 today. But there has also been 31,000 plus cases of prison staff affected by COVID-19. And that, of course, shows that then the decision not to let it spread into the community fails, because obviously the staff comes and goes from the prison. There's been also 5,117 new cases only in the week of October 6, which is itself a 4% increase over the previous week. And about deaths, there's already 1,266 deaths in custody from COVID-19 in the United States. 150 are new deaths from a month ago. And 85 staff have died of COVID-19 in the last 6 months. But at least we have that data that is reliable and should move us to action in the United States. Unfortunately, we don't have that kind of information with many Latin American countries, or we have it piecemeal. And the final point I want to make about overcrowding, we have to be careful with official statistics about overcrowding, because when a state says, yes, we have about 150% overcapacity, they're really starting from a point of what would be 100% capacity that is very misleading, because states count beds. But when we're talking about collective cells particularly, the beds don't account for the living space that each prisoner should have. And so I've seen prisons where you go in and in a cell the size of a big living room in any house, you have 50 beds, but the beds are crowded together. And so the overcrowding is much more than, say, if they have 150 people living in 100 beds, that's not 150%. It's a lot more than that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Mendez. And one question that I actually have, a follow-up question that I have for Eric is, we think of these very challenging problems, and we think of all these marginalized groups, right, that are very affected by COVID-19 and that their situation has worsened during COVID-19. And we have started to reflect on the need for participation, right? I mean, what does the right to participation mean when it comes to state measures and administrative measures related to COVID-19 and the topic that we're discussing today, especially persons with disabilities and persons deprived of liberty? What do you think that right should look like, you know, for the group that we're discussing today when it comes to COVID-19 and that state response?
Thank you for raising that. It's another one of those extremely overlooked and misunderstood questions. One of the ways in which the UN Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities is transformative is that it says that people with disabilities have a right to participate in matters of public policy as well as human rights, oversight, enforcement, policy, program implementation from top to bottom on matters that affect them through their representative organizations, so that it's not just that you want a token person with a disability involved somehow, that you need a mechanism to make sure that you have some form of democratic representation. Now, while that's good, the reality is, even if you have disability participation, everyone always forgets the people in detention. The people in detention often have psychiatric disabilities, they have intellectual disabilities. In any society, much as all people with disabilities are subject to discrimination, and we don't want to pit the groups against each other, it's usually people with physical disabilities, people who are blind, who are better organized and often representative. Just because you're blind doesn't mean that you know what it's like to be locked up in an institution with a diagnosis of mental illness, or people with intellectual disabilities are completely left off the spectrum. So if you want to have a representative group, some form of feedback, it is not happening. Professor Mendez mentioned the problem of transparency, that no one knows what's going on in these institutions. So combine those two problems. There's no transparency, there's no oversight, and there's absolutely no representation. So these are truly the most forgotten people. My organization, Disability Rights International, has worked very hard to go into countries and train and support people with disabilities, especially formerly detained people with intellectual and psychosocial disabilities, to represent their own rights. We have to look at that as a long-term investment. It's not something that's going to happen overnight. And I promise you that the token person with a disability cannot possibly represent the enormous diversity of experience. So it's one of those issues. We had to see it coming. We have to plan in advance for it. And we will never have responsive human rights policies if the stakeholders are not involved in the solutions.
Thank you for that, Eric. And one question, Sophia, because the Inter-American Commission works a lot with states, right? Is there anything that states are doing that you can cite as examples to address the challenges that are being discussed today? And in your view, do you think any of these measures have a glimpse of effectiveness or could be effective in the future? How do you see the overall state response?
Thank you, Rosa. I think that states are basically carrying out two types of measures. The first one is reducing overpopulated prisons, but also establish measures to prevent the spread of the virus. For me, the most important measures are the ones that are also after the pandemic, because as Juan Mendez was mentioning in the paper, there may be a lot of decrease from the legislatures or from the executive saying that they are going to release a big number of persons at the end because of the lack of transparency that prevails in the region. It's very, very hard to know what is really going on. So I would like to highlight two very important measures that for me are very, very relevant. And I think a lot of people in Honduras and also in Mexico have a lot of expectations. The first one is a decree that reform the criminal code of Honduras. There was a very famous article that is the 184 article of the criminal code that established mandatory pretrial detention regarding 21 crimes that are like the most prevalent crimes, like drug-related crimes. And basically because of this reform that took place in 2013, there was a huge increase in overpopulation in Honduras. So with this reform, basically, the state is complying with the recommendation that the Commission has established through different mechanisms, through press releases, reports, and letters, and in every way. And now the mandatory pretrial detention has been abolished. So this is like a great step, and actually the Commission talked about this very important measure in the previous press release regarding persons deprived of liberty that was published last month. The second very important measure was a new law in Mexico that is called the amnesty law. This was not adopted because of the context of the pandemic, but it was accelerated because of this. So basically, with this reform or this law, they are trying to release persons deprived of liberty that meet different criteria, like, for example, indigenous persons that didn't have interpretation or didn't have an effective access to justice, women who had abortion after 12 weeks of pregnancy, and people that are very poor, and people who didn't they didn't have any commission of violent crimes, especially possession of drugs. So this is like a great progress and advance on Mexico, because this country has been very tough regarding all the issues regarding drugs. So this is a great thing. However, after more than 5 months of the publication of this reform, any amnesty has been given. All the commissions that are going to analyze all the applications that are requesting amnesties are already established. However, because of the bureaucracy of Mexican institutions, this has not really taken place. However, I think that in general, this is a very important measure, and hopefully because of that, a lot of people will be released. And another kind of measures that the states are putting in place is these actions to prevent the virus, as Professor Mendez was saying, suspending visits to prisons, which has put persons deprived of liberty in very, very bad situations, considering that a lot of the basic supplies of food, even health or hygiene, comes from the families and relatives, to the prisons, because states do not provide with these basic products. And also states say that they have been establishing like protocols and other kind of like sanitary condition like measures, but I honestly don't think that they are really making a big difference. And I think that a very clear example of the lack of efficiency of these measures is the testing. And this measure was analyzed by the Commission in the previous press release, where, for instance, Brazil, that has the fourth largest prison population around the world, by the beginning of September, has only applied testing to the 0.4% of its population. In Honduras, that has one of the largest numbers of prison population, only has applied the testing in less than the 20% of the total population. However, this total percent also includes staff of the prison, so it's not really 20%, it's less than that. So this is like, in numbers, like a really clear example of how inefficient these measures are really like resulting. So considering the situation that these persons are facing, I think that it's very clear, it's urgent that is take urgent measures, because right now all these prisons are basically time bombs.
Thank you, Sophia. And Professor Mendez, I wanted to ask you a follow-up question to this, especially on the question of torture. We know there's a lot of inefficiency when it comes to the adoption of measures, as you have discussed, and also Sophia has discussed. What do you think would be important and necessary to effectively prevent torture? And which are the centers that we're the most concerned about when it comes to the issue of torture? And also keeping in mind all the challenges that we have with transparency and the issues that you have mentioned already.
Well, as you know, the preferred methodology to implement the obligation to prevent torture in the Torture Convention, both the Inter-American and the Universal Convention, is having regular prison visits by a national or several other prevention mechanisms. And in some countries, they work very well. But it's also always been a challenge to make the states take seriously these system of visits that have to be regular but also unannounced. And in this period, the states have come up with a ready-made excuse for not taking these visits seriously. And it's true that because the states don't take them seriously, they're also underfunded, and so the very members of the national preventive mechanisms have had to struggle to be prepared to conduct visits in this very dangerous environment created by COVID-19. But I have to stress that prevention of torture, is not only about prison visits. Torture happens in so many different places that are, not even remotely accessible to an independent and impartial control mechanism, that we have to combine measures to prevent torture of different sorts, including, as the Convention Against Torture says, periodic review of the practices of institutions so that they don't commit torture. I also think that sometimes conditions in centers of detention amount to torture. Not always, and some conditions that are not up to par may still cause cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment or punishment that doesn't quite rise to the level of torture, but is nevertheless equally forbidden and without excuses and without any situation of emergency that might tolerate it. And I would say that we should start with the premise that people who are deprived of liberty, even if they have been deprived of liberty pursuant to a regular judicial order, either a conviction and a sentence or a regular order to keep them in preventive detention, they lose the right to mobility and the right to go home, but they don't lose any other right that we call a human right. And particularly, they have the right to health. The right to health means, under the Nelson Mandela rules, that the state has to provide them with the quality of treatment that is available in the community. And what's available in the community may not be enough, but at least it's a standard that if they cannot be given that level of treatment in prison, they should be taken out of prison and taken to a hospital where they can get the level of treatment that is available in the community. And I want to stress that the right to health is not just a right to health care. It's also a right to preventive measures. So the inmates everywhere in the world have a right to be protected from COVID-19, and that's a right that is being violated daily in all prisons and everywhere. And the right to prevention means that, for example, if someone tests positive, you don't take them out and put them supposedly in isolation when you really putting them all together, as has happened in many prisons and in the United States as well, and in conditions in which they are not protected from each other, and the people who take care of them are also inadequately equipped with protective equipment. And so these situations exacerbate the violation of their rights, but also they're very inefficient in terms of controlling the pandemic, because any place of congregation of a lot of people, and prisons are like that, are, we're learning the lessons, they are the spreader events that then are very difficult to control the contagion to the rest of the community. So even if we didn't care about inmates, if we care about trying to contain the spread, we should be paying more attention to what happens in all places of deprivation of liberty.
Thank you, Professor Mendez. And I actually have one final question, and that's for Jim. And I wanted to ask you, when you were at the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights and you were rapporteur on persons deprived of liberty, one of the probably most important issues you worked on was pretrial detention and reducing the use of it, right? So what is the relevance of the recommendations that the Commission issued under that report and other settings to the situation that we have today with persons deprived of liberty and COVID-19?
Thanks for the question. I think Juan spoke to this earlier, so I'll just try and add a bit to what he said. Over the course of the period, say 2000, mid-2000s to 2010, 11, 12, 13, across Latin America and in the Western Hemisphere in general, the abuse of pretrial detention was rampant, to the point of, in some states, 60, 70, or 80%, and in a few states even more, of those held in detention centers had not been convicted of any crime. So they're legally innocent. And sort of the core principle of due process guarantees is that the state should not be able to seize your liberty and incarcerate you without having convicted you of a serious offense. And they should not be able to do that without a conviction, save in exceptional circumstances. And the Inter-American standards are fairly clear. There has to be evidence that the person will flee the jurisdiction or destroy proof, evidence, or undermine the proceeding. That it's not enough, certainly not as Honduras did with the 21 enumerated crimes. If you've been charged for any of these, we're going to incarcerate you as a certainty. That certainly is in direct contravention. The situation, I think, improved over the 2000, 2010, 2020 period in percentage numbers, as in the overall percentage of those held in pretrial detention reduced, but the overall number of people held in prison in general throughout the hemisphere increased, and in absolute terms, those in pretrial detention likely increased as well. But I wanted to flag something, and it's related to your question, in terms of forcing us to think and act more aggressively. I think Juan is also right that we don't know what's happening in terms of death, illness. There aren't regular tests. We're getting partial information from different countries. In Peru, where I've been following the data, things have gotten quite bad. The numbers are high of people who died from COVID. Another thing, if I could just add a comment to something that Juan said, when he talks about the anxiety and the uncertainty of not knowing whether or not one is likely to be infected, whether one is likely to be exposed, of not knowing when one is in detention, whether their families will be able to visit them, which is essential, and it's always the first demand of those in detention. It's what's happening with our family visits. They're being humiliated, where they're being strip searched, or that's always more than their own safety. Those in prison are fighting for their family members. That anxiety also in the dangerous cocktail that is the mix in detention centers leads to riots and violence and other incidents. In Peru, where they had not had major riots for nearly a decade, because they had a really interesting process. That was part of why I'm studying Peru so closely. Because of COVID, because of the mismanagement, because of the failures, the insecurity, the anxiety, they've had deadly riots again. So again, just one more reason on the long list of reasons why the preventive rights included in the right to health need to be respected, and there need to be systems, and people need to be assured that their basic survival will be guaranteed. Why it should be respected is because when that doesn't happen, you have riots. But let me just say one last thing, Russ, if I can. And that is, I think in human rights, particularly in the Western Hemisphere, we implicitly accept the legitimacy of detention. This is something that Eric was pushing back on, and I credit him for this. And then we carve out areas where, but it's not okay to hold someone who doesn't pose a threat to the community. It's not okay to hold someone when their health is going to be compromised because they're in an overcrowded situation. It's not okay to hold someone in pretrial detention. It's not okay to hold a juvenile in a center with an adult, etc. I think in human rights, we need to be more aggressive in questioning the very idea of detention at all. Prisons don't work. They have been an unmitigated failure. I am willing to accept that there is a very, very small percentage of extremely dangerous people dangerous to themselves and others, who might have to be restrained in closed centers. But that really needs to be exceptional. And I think we need to be more aggressive in calling for the elimination of the carceral state as we know it from a human rights perspective, in the way that I think Eric has said clearly with people with disabilities. And if I can just finally just show an analogy, I think we saw this in this country with the George Floyd incident, and then the massive protests that were calling for defunding the police. I think those of us in the human rights movement were caught flat-footed because we haven't been calling for defunding the police. We haven't said the police actually as an institution must serve a very, very, very limited function. They shouldn't be answering distress calls of people who have mental health issues. They shouldn't be responding in many ways. And I think we had a come to Jesus moment collectively in the human rights movement with regard to police violence that informed us that we should be asking for more than just police shouldn't shoot and kill unarmed suspects. No, it's much more than we need to do to reform the police, and it's much more that we need to do to reform the carceral state. And one last thing that I would say is to be hopeful, which is tough, but there is some basis for hope. In Connecticut, I'm working on a project, because I'm in Connecticut now, with university partners and civil society groups and formerly incarcerated people. And one of the things that's happened, and we don't have the data yet, and Juan mentioned this, and I think he's right, there has been in Connecticut a reduction now of 50% from the high point in detention. And a lot of it is because the police stopped arresting people during COVID, because they didn't want to get into close contact, because they were following protocols, because it wasn't truly necessary to arrest people. Really interesting. and I've seen similar figures, not quite as high in New York State and other states. It may be that when we come out of this nightmare, that there has been a reduction in arrests, and it's a pipeline: arrest, prosecution, conviction, incarceration, or arrest, incarceration, pretrial detention problem, and detention. It may be that we come out and see that there has actually been a reduction, a significant reduction in detention centers. And we're also going to be facing budget shortfalls across the world. I think we need to be ready to engage in the debate. The way Juan said, we should have a debate about pretrial detention. Yes, I think the debate should be even more aggressive. We should be talking about transfer of resources from the carceral state, from putting people into jail and prison and closed centers, to other ways of responding to criminality and to conflict with law. Throughout the Americas, from Canada down to the extreme south of Argentina, there's an equation between crime and prison. Oh, the person they should go to jail. We need to push back really hard on that, and we may have an opportunity with that post-COVID. So a long answer, but I just wanted to get in. I want to get in that thought about a possible window of opportunity that we really need to pry open, as Juan was saying, not just on pretrial detention, on detention as well. Of a basic core idea that is a legitimate and worthwhile and useful response to criminality, because I don't think it is.
Thank you so much, Jim, and thank you to all the panelists for highlighting not only the dire and very challenging situation of persons deprived of liberty, but many interrelated issues: transparency, the need for participation, the need for information collection and state action, the need to explore those alternative measures to detention, and the need to take into consideration the very specific needs of persons in psychiatric hospitals and other marginalized groups that are really deeply affected by the problems that we discussed today. We actually have a number of questions in the chat, so I want to move on to those because we still have some time. And actually, the first question I have in the chat is from Alejandra Gonza, who we all know very well. And she actually had a question that is very well connected, Jim, to what you just stated, and also to what Juan and Eric were discussing about the need to advance. She's asking, do we need to advance from reducing overcrowding to decarceration and closure of jails? So I don't know if any of the panelists have anything to add to this question. It's very connected to what you all have been discussing today.
Well, I think Jim answered that question. Maybe he had read the question in the chat. I just want to be clear that if I argue for a real debate about the abuse of preventive detention, that doesn't exclude a broader and more fundamental debate about detention, and particularly the need to come back to what the Human Rights Committee of the United Nations has said, that preventive detention should be the exception and not the rule. I'm not sure that we can, in the short term, defund the police and defund what Jim calls a carceral state. And I think that's a word, but anyway, talking about the state reminds me of the deep state. I hope that's not what Jim meant, but it seems to me that we, without losing the final objective of abandoning this whole failed idea of incarceration. And with that, I completely agree with Jim, and I suspect with the question, the person who asked the question. I think we should not also deprive ourselves of the possibility of doing a step-by-step, stage-by-stage ability to reform and to improve on the system. Again, I don't think one vision excludes the other. And if it does exclude it, then we are, toiling against ourselves. But yeah, I think a revision of the whole idea of detention is way overdue. And maybe I share some of Jim's optimism that the COVID-19 pandemic is giving us a chance, if we are smart to use it, to engage in that debate and to get some serious results.
Can I just add a spin? Because I would certainly not disagree with anything that my mentor, literally my mentor, my boss, my first boss at America's Watch, Juan, says. But a slightly different spin. I think that when we engage in the debate about incarceration, we start from a premise that the state can incarcerate those that it has convicted, say. Can't incarcerate those who it has not convicted except in certain circumstances. The point I'm making, that maybe this agrees with the premise of Alejandra's question, and hello, Alejandra, is I think we need to develop arguments from human rights that put the onus and the burden on the state in any case in which the state seeks to deprive someone of their liberty, that the state has to demonstrate it on an individualized basis. Sort of the same way with pretrial detention, the state has to demonstrate, no, you are a flight risk. You are likely to destroy evidence. It can't say, oh no, you're charged with this article of the penal code, so you got to pretrial detention. No, we ought to reverse rather the burden, so that the state needs to demonstrate that there is some specific reason why there is no other rehabilitative option that would produce results, that the only thing that can be done with you is to put you in a closed institution. And I think that it seems like a small change. It's about burden of proof, but I think that idea would move us more quickly away from mass incarceration. And I mean, again, Juan is a pragmatist. He's great strategically. I agree. But I do think that there is a piece, and there's probably a few law review articles to write. And I look back, for instance, if Juan, the Velázquez Rodriguez case, I'm not going to tell Juan about it. He litigated it. Okay. But that case started in a period when most people would have said there are no obligations regarding third parties. Only the state can be held reliable. And the genius of the case is that it held the state reliable for the actions of third parties, which opens the door to corporate social responsibility, opens the door to women's rights, the private becoming public in international law, et cetera, et cetera. I think we need something like that in the realm of human rights with regard to incarceration, because it's a failure at so many levels, and one more level, the body count and inside detention centers and outside detention centers from COVID will be one more ruthless argument against the carceral state.
Eric, did you want to add something?
Been a very stimulating discussion and learning a lot. I mean, it's great to see the confluence between what we've been arguing in disability rights, which is, you know, you're now talking about ending incarceration and the incarceral state. That's what we've been fighting for decades in the psychiatric and other disability area. The institutions don't do it. And so to see that the conversation is coming around in other areas is wonderful, and important that we can learn from each other. So that's perhaps, again, looking for reasons for optimism that these different liberation movements, and they really are liberation movements, have a lot to learn from each other. One note of caution, though, is that I heard it from some of the other speakers, and in some of the literature that I've read, when they talk about getting rid of the incarceral state, that most people don't need to be there except the most extreme people who are most dangerous to themselves or others. The exception to the rule seems to be describing exactly the standard for which people are institutionalized based upon psychiatric disabilities. So let's learn from each other And let's not say, let's wipe out all incarceration except for those crazily mentally ill people who have to be locked up. It's very important that the liberation movements reinforce each other. And again, I'll just add one last plug. You asked also, Rosa, about the problem of the lack of participation by people with disabilities and how we understand these problems. Again, documentation, transparency are extra difficult under circumstances of this COVID-19. We banded together with a group of 6 other disability organizations around the world and did a worldwide survey in which people with disabilities themselves could respond to what experiences of discrimination and abuse they are facing around the world. And next Thursday, the 22nd, we are releasing a global report of the impact of COVID-19 on people with disabilities. It's based upon respondents from 136 countries, thousands of responses by people with disabilities, including people who are incarcerated and institutionalized. It'll be a fabulously interesting report in which we collected the firsthand testimonies of people with disabilities. You can look it up. It's COVID-19-DRM.com. That's Disability Rights Monitor, and I strongly encourage people to take a look. It's also posted on our website, Disability Rights International. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Eric. And I think Sophia has something to add as well.
Yes, thank you, Rosa. Regarding like the importance and urgency to reduce overcrowding, I would like to highlight the report on alternative measures to pretrial detention. This was actually published within the mandate of Jean Cavallaro as thematic rapporteur. This report, I think, that is extremely relevant in this context. It has a lot of standards and recommendations on the issues, provides an like analysis on how to apply gender perspective, but also differentiated approaches. And I think that in a very important way, it has an analysis on different measures taken by the states on how they really reduce the levels of pretrial detention. And they are very innovative measures, like for example, in Brazil, the custody hearings, or in Bolivia, the hearings that were taking place in prisons. I think that if we don't put more pressure now on reducing the levels of overcrowding, I don't see when we are going to make a change, because what we are living right now is extremely serious and urgent. So I think that from our different like works or spheres, we really need to work on making visible a reality that it is invisible, and we have to put people outside. There's no way that improving detention conditions like states will guarantee the right to life or personal integrity under this pandemic. So I think that that has been the focus, put people outside.
Thank you, Sophia. And I actually have a question for you from one of my students, Luis Enrique Mendoza Choque. He's asking, to you in particular, is there any action from the inter-American system to protect immigrants detained in the US during these times of COVID-19?
Yeah, actually, the only precautionary measures that has been granted in this context is regarding migrants in detention centers in Seattle. It was published last week, so I think that it would be very relevant that you go, and take a look. I haven't read the resolution, but I know that the only one regarding this topic, the provision of liberty, has been regarding migrants' rights, and also the Commission has issued a lot of like press releases regarding the U.S. measures taking, to prevent asylum seekers and migrants to come to the U.S. and how they have been put in detention centers that are completely against the human rights. And a few days ago, also the Commission tweeted, about what is going on in Georgia in one of the detention centers regarding the sterilization against women, basically from Latin America. And I cannot tell you more, but there will be more monitoring of the situation regarding these aspects. And this is basically in the context of COVID, where a lot of like problems regarding negligence in health are taking place in this kind of detention centers.
Thank you, Sophia. I have a question also from Luis to Jim. He's asking, is there any good practice in the region of a country that, in basically in protecting the rights of persons deprived of liberty during the pandemic?
So I don't know. Juan early was citing the many decisions throughout the Americas authorizing releases that were then not complied with. You cited the case of 5,000 in the US. I know in Peru, eventually there was a determination and then it wasn't implemented. And I'm not sure the extent to which it's been implemented. I'll leave this question to others. I really don't know of any states that I would say have been leaders and have responded in ways consistent with the guidelines issued by the Commission. There have been one thing that has been good in that sense is there have been legal bodies, Brazilian courts that have cited the Commission's resolutions and guidance, but I don't know, and maybe others do, of good practices or best practices in the Americas in responding to COVID. I think there's been okay practices, bad practices, and terrible practices, but I could be wrong and I'm happy to be corrected.
Thank you, Jim. I actually have a number of questions from Edisonia Cook for all of you. One of them is if there is any sort of evidence of creative or human rights-based approaches to detention. Is there, or any sort of virtual solutions, for example, to detention that have been effective in this context?
Well, as Jim rightly put it, every state is a complex unit in the Americas and elsewhere. And there are good initiatives that then are frustrated, and there are terrible initiatives that are not actually controlled as they should be. And then, you know, the picture will always be mixed. I don't know that it will always be mixed, but it's at this point, I don't think we can say that anybody has really succeeded all the way. Even some of the good measures that Sophia was talking about, you have to contemplate them also in the same country with measures that go in the wrong direction. Like, for example, in Mexico, the constitutional amendment to make more crimes susceptible to what it's called prisión preventiva oficiosa, that is ex officio. And again, by the nature of the crime, the courts are obliged to keep the person in detention without having been found guilty of any crime. But that's not to negate some of the good initiatives that Mexico has taken. Particularly, I would say the courts in Mexico, the Supreme Court particularly, whether they actually, you know, become sustainable has a lot to do with what I said at the beginning about the pressure of public opinion. I mean, many decisions in Brazil and in Argentina that I know of cited the guidelines of the Inter-American Commission in acordadas, or however they're called in other countries, that are kind of non-binding instructions to lower courts that should be good guidance. And unfortunately, when it came to applying them and applying them to specific individuals who were entitled to some forms of amelioration of their situation because of the COVID-19 pandemic, the pressure from public opinion was such that they stopped happening. And in fact, it was pressure that was not backed by any serious study or statistics. I mean, the minute a headline says somebody who was guilty of this kind of crime 10 years ago is now in the streets again, that paralyzes courts. So one of the problems that we have, at least certainly in Latin America, is the need for courts to assert their independence and to apply the law correctly. That would not completely satisfy all our requirements, but it would be a very good first step.
Thank you, Professor Mendez. And we have a few minutes left, so I was wondering if any of our speakers, if you have any final remarks before we close this event tonight.
Well, I will say just, in terms of the last question, in terms of good models, the good model of detention of people with disabilities is non-detention. There is no one country that effectively does not detain people on the basis of disability. And yet in every country, there are islands of really good programs and examples of places. I mean, Rio Negro in Argentina, for example, an area where people with disabilities are very actively supported to live in the community. But again, in looking for the positive models, sometimes they're invisible because there's no program. People with major support needs who have disabilities, who might be locked up in some societies, are actually fully integrated into communities in countries that don't have services at all. If you go to rural Peru, a person with a psychiatric diagnosis who would be locked up in Argentina or Washington, D.C., may be fully integrated into society without any form of mental health program whatsoever, just because the society is accepting of them and integrates them. So we don't always have to look for a program to see a good model. What we have to see is a society that's fully inclusive. And that is not something that depends necessarily on law or wealth. It happens everywhere.
Sophia, any final remarks?
I would like to reiterate that I think the time to make a change is now. We are living an unprecedented time of pandemic. We need to use all the tools that we have to make change regarding persons deprived of liberty, who most of the times are there because they didn't have an effective access to justice, and also because they have been facing a structural situation of discrimination based on different factors. So from the academia, from civil society organizations, but also from human rights entities, we need to put more emphasis on putting people out. And I would also like to say that I am available to any of the participants of this event if they want to have more information about what the Commission is doing right now regarding all the approaches in this pandemic, not only about persons with deprived of liberty, but other different groups. I'm more than available. I will type my email in case they have any comment or questions. I'm available. I would also like to thank you again, Rosa, for opening a very important discussion, because usually this is a topic that no one really is talking about. So thank you so much.
Jim, any final words?
Just to add on to what has been said by Eric and Sophia, and Juan has alluded to this as well, and you and some of the questions, that I think there really is an opportunity because post-COVID, one of the things we'll see is massive widespread budget shortfalls throughout the hemisphere and beyond. And incarcerating people is very expensive. It's very costly. In some societies more than others. But one argument that we have is this is costly and it's not effective. And then I think we want to be ready, hit the ground running with alternatives for people with disabilities, for mental health issues, for others, for pretrial detention, for juveniles, for adults across the board. We want to be ready because I think this is sort of, as they say about the Mandarin, they say, it may not be true, the Mandarin character for crisis is danger and opportunity. So we should see this crisis. There's a lot of danger, but there's also potential opportunity.
Professor Mendez, you have the final words.
Thank you. I actually want to thank you, Rosa, and all the participants and the audience for the opportunity to bring these important matters up front. And I especially want to thank my fellow panelists for bringing perspectives to this that on the one hand are necessarily different points of view, but all of them very relevant, and at the same time encouraging, because the more that we talk about these things and we try to find out more about what's actually happening, the more that we equip ourselves with weapons to prevent torture and to do so, in rational and persuasive ways. And so I just want to fully agree with all three of you and you too, Rosa, about we're living very bad moments, but there is opportunity there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much to all of you, to all of our speakers, and thank you to our speakers also for the amazing and dedicated work that they do to advance the human rights of all persons. I have a lot of respect for you. Thank you so much for being here with us, and thank you to all of the participants tonight. And I hope we stay hopeful. I hope we stay hopeful, even though we have very dire challenges. One of the objectives of these discussions is to try to also discuss potential solutions and ways to move forward. Have a good night. Thank you so much.